She walked into the gala wearing a dress worth more than most made in a year yet hours earlier. She'd been scrubbing floors. By the end of the night, she would destroy the man who invited her and take everything he thought was his forever. The ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel shimmered with gold light, the kind that could make even the coldest glass of champagne look warm outside. The December air was brittle, but in here, the air was thick with money its scent woven into. The silk gowns, the polished marble, and the careful laughter of the city's most powerful people. It was the night of the year's most prestigious charity gala, where million-dollar donations were exchanged like calling cards, and reputations were as fragile and as valuable as crystal. Edward Langston stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying his domain like a king awaiting a courtier's arrival. Tall, silver-haired, the face of Langston capital for decades, he was the sort of man who could summon reporters with a single phone call and destroy a career with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. His smile tonight was fixed, predatory not for the benefit of his guests, but for a plan that had been weeks in the making. 3 days earlier, the target of his little spectacle had been on her knees, scrubbing the corner of his office. Amelia Cross, a quiet, almost invisible presence in the glass and steel fortress of Langston Capital. Her uniform smelled faintly of cleaning solvent, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes downcast as if she'd been trained never to meet the gaze of the elite she served. Edward had approached her with deliberate slowness, a gold envelope pinched between his fingers like a trophy, a charity gala, he'd said, his voice smooth but laced with something colder. This Saturday, dress code, peak elegance, surely. You have something in your wardrobe that fits the occasion. Behind him, 2 of his senior partners chuckled, unable to hide their amusement. The laughter followed Amelia down the corridor long after Edward had walked away. The invitation had been sent not as a gesture of kindness, but as a trap, a spectacle he intended to stage in front of New York's financial aristocracy. He had already arranged for a half-dozen social columnists, fashion bloggers, and celebrity photographers to be present. They would see her, this cleaning woman, trying to pass herself off among the powerful, and they would document every awkward smile, every ill-fitting seam of her borrowed dress, every flash of insecurity. It would be, as Edward told his inner circle, an educational moment, his phrase for public humiliation. But there was something Edward Langston didn't know, something no one in that ballroom could have guessed. Amelia Cross had accepted the invitation without hesitation. She had looked him in the eye when she said, "Thank you, Mr. Langston, I'll be there." No wavering, no stammer, no hint of the embarrassment he had expected. And now, as the orchestra's violins swelled and the first glasses of champagne were poured, a quiet murmur began to ripple through the room. She was here. The elevator doors opened and Amelia stepped out, not in a faded second-hand dress, not in something hastily borrowed, but in a gown of midnight silk that clung to her like water. The neckline was modest yet commanding, the cut flawless, the fabric shimmering, with an understated elegance that made the sequins and rhinestones around her seem garish. Her hair was swept into a classic chignon, exposing the curve of her neck, where a single diamond pendant caught the light and held it captive. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Edward's smile twitched. This was not the script he had written. From her first step into the ballroom, she carried herself as though she had been born to occupy this space not as an intruder, but as someone returning to claim what had always been hers. Her chin was lifted, her eyes calm, her gait unhurried. She didn't skim the room nervously. Instead, her gaze seemed to take stock of it, as though she were cataloging every face for a reason no one else could yet imagine. Whispers began to weave themselves through the glittering crowd. Who is she? Where did she get that dress? Is that a real diamond? The irony was almost poetic. In trying to set the stage for her humiliation, Edward had inadvertently orchestrated the perfect moment for her to steal the spotlight. But this wasn't just about a dress, or the way she seemed immune to the undercurrent of cruelty buzzing beneath the chandelier light. There was an energy round Amelia, quiet, unnerving confidence that didn't belong to someone invited here as a joke. It belonged to someone with a story that could topple empires, and she knew it. Her eyes met Edward's across the room, and though his mouth curled into something resembling a greeting, the look she returned was nothing short of a silent challenge. The kind of look that said, "You think you know who I am, but you don't, not yet. If you're just joining us, welcome to Voices Unfold. Tonight's story is not just about wealth or status. It's about the danger of underestimating the person you think you've already defined. Because in the next few hours, Edward Langston and everyone in this ballroom will discover that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you've been trained to ignore. Before we go any further, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so we can keep bringing you more stories like this, stories where the truth unfolds in ways no one sees coming. Now, here's a question for you to ponder as the story unfolds. If you were invited to an event by someone you knew intended to humiliate you, what would you do? A. Decline the invitation and avoid the trap. B. Accept it and turn the moment into your own stage. Drop your answer or B in the comments. I can't wait to see what you think. Amelia didn't just enter the ballroom, she claimed it. Every step seemed deliberate, as though she had spent a lifetime preparing for this one moment. The silk of her gown whispered with her movement, a quiet counterpoint to the murmur that had begun to ripple across the glittering sea of guests. People angled their heads for a better look, conversations faltering mid-sentence, champagne flutes pausing in midair. A subtle shift in atmosphere was already taking place. The laughter that had been so easy and careless minutes before was now tinged with something sharper, something uncertain. She moved with an elegance that didn't imitate the room it commanded it, where most newcomers to such an event might seek approval. Amelia walked as though no such thing was necessary. Her gaze didn't dart, it landed. It landed on people who, moments before, might have dismissed her with a glance and lingered just long enough to unsettle them. A woman in a sequin gown found herself straightening her posture. A man in a tailored tuxedo quickly adjusted his cufflinks near the center of the ballroom. Edward Langston watched, his confidence eroding in increments. Too small for the untrained eye, but impossible for Amelia to miss. He raised his glass in what appeared to be a cordial gesture, the kind reserved for acquaintances one barely remembers. But his eyes carried a question he didn't want to voice. How did she look like she belonged here more than some of the people who had spent decades buying their way into this world? The crowd seemed to part for her without realizing they were doing it. A few whispered behind jeweled hands, "She must have borrowed that dress," one woman murmured to her companion, "or rented it. No way she could own something like that." The companion nodded quickly, as if agreeing would shield them from the creeping feeling that they were missing some crucial detail. There was, after all, something in Amelia's presence that didn't fit the narrative they'd been fed. A young man in a velvet dinner jacket stepped into her path, smiling with the kind of arrogance born from a lifetime of effortless charm. "You're new here," he said, the words delivered as if they were a fact that needed no response. Amelia offered a smile that was polite, yet layered an answer that was not an answer. "Am I?" she said softly, and the question hung in the air between them like an unsolved riddle. The man laughed, but it was a second too late, his composure momentarily thrown off by the way she had shifted the balance of control. Without raising her voice, by the time she reached the foot of the grand staircase, Edward was already moving toward her, flanked by a pair of associates who followed his lead as though the very movement of his steps were an order. His smile was too wide. His handshake extended just a fraction to early signs of a man trying to regain his footing. "Amelia," he said warmly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "What a surprise. I'm delighted you accepted the invitation." Her gaze met his without wavering. "Surprised?" she asked, her tone even, her expression almost serene. "You seemed quite certain I wouldn't come." Edward chuckled, though the sound lacked its usual depth. "Well, I just didn't know if this sort of environment was your kind of thing." He gestured broadly to the glittering expanse of chandeliers, gowns, and polished silver. "This sort of environment," she repeated, as though tasting the words, considering their weight. Then she tilted her head slightly. "You mean a room full of people wearing masks?" It was a quiet remark, but those close enough to hear stiffened. The words carried no open insult, yet they were laced with an accuracy that made people instinctively defensive. Edward's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he smoothed it back into place. "Well, I hope you're not intimidated," he said. She allowed a pause to bloom between them. Her eyes locked on his. "No, Edward," she said finally. "I'm exactly where I belong." The statement didn't just answer his question, it rewrote it, erasing the power dynamic he had been counting on. Around them, the subtle, unspoken hierarchy that governed. Such rooms began to tremble, almost imperceptibly. Some guests, sensing a shift they couldn't yet name, found themselves watching her more closely. From across the room, a senator's wife whispered to a friend, "My God, look how she holds herself." The friend smirked in response, though it looked more like a shield than a genuine smile. "Confidence can be borrowed too," she said. But even as she spoke, she didn't sound certain. The music from the string quartet swelled, but it seemed to underscore the silence that had fallen around Amelia and Edward. He took a small step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You've certainly made an impression. That tends to happen," she replied. Her tone was calm, but in her eyes was a glint of something more, something that hinted this was no accidental moment, no lucky coincidence of posture and dress. This was choreography, every step placed with intent. For a man who had orchestrated countless corporate takeovers, Edward was beginning to recognize the discomfort of losing control in a game he thought he was winning. And as Amelia turned from him to greet another guest, her movements graceful but deliberate, he realized the evening was no longer unfolding according to his plan. What no one else yet understood was that Amelia had walked into this ballroom, not to endure their judgment, but to turn their gaze inward, to make them question the very ground they stood on. The dress, the composure, the unshakable calm. They weren't a shield. They were an opening move, and the game had only just begun. The clink of crystal and the low hum of polite conversation filled the air, but Amelia felt the weight of every glance, every measured whisper. She didn't flinch under it. Instead, she moved slowly toward the center of the room, the hem of her midnight gown brushing the polished marble as if marking the path she had chosen long ago. The orchestra's melody was delicate, but beneath it was a tension and unspoken awareness that something was building. The kind of energy that precedes a storm. Edward's voice cut through the room like a practice cue, warm enough to seem genuine, but pitched to draw attention. "Everyone," he called, lifting his champagne glass, "I'd like to introduce our very special guest tonight, Amelia Cross, one of our most dedicated cleaning staff." A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, not the kind that rose from genuine humor, but the sharp-edged laughter of people tasting cruelty on their tongues and finding it sweet. Camera flashes erupted, catching her mid-step, eager to immortalize her in a frame designed to humiliate. Amelia stopped in the center of the marble expanse, her posture unshaken. She turned her head, scanning the faces around her, those laughing openly, those smiling tightly, those pretending to look elsewhere. She wasn't searching for sympathy. She was committing them to memory. Her expression was serene, almost unsettling. In its stillness, as if she knew something none of them did, a woman in a silver gown, Patricia Weston, approached with a group of friends trailing behind like jeweled shadows. "Amelia, darling," Patricia began, her voice dripping with counterfeit warmth. "That gown is simply unexpected. Tell me, how long did it take you to find something appropriate?" "Must have been quite the challenge." "It wasn't," Amelia replied, her tone steady, but carrying an undertone that made Patricia hesitate. "This dress has been waiting for this room for a very long time." Another voice joined in a brittle laugh from Vivian Chambers, daughter of an oil magnate. "Oh, and where exactly does one find a dress like that? A vintage shop, or perhaps a lucky thrift store find?" Amelia's smile deepened, though her eyes sharpened. "My mother wore this dress the last time she attended an event in a room like this. That was over 20 years ago when she was still Evelyn Langston." The words struck like a dropped glass in a silent room. The hum of conversation faltered. Edward, who had been standing with his close friends, turned his head slowly, his face tightening as if he had just felt the first crack in a carefully constructed wall. "What did you say?" "Evelyn Langston," Amelia repeated, her voice clear and unhurried. "My mother, your half-sister." A murmur swept through the guests' confusion, disbelief. Curiosity laced with the thrill of potential scandal, Edward stepped forward, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. That's absurd. My father had no. Amelia's interruption was quiet, but it sliced through the space between them. Arthur Langston was my grandfather as much as he was yours. My mother was his eldest child, and when he died, she was erased from the family records because it was more convenient for certain people. People like you. Helena Langston, Edward's wife, stiffened beside him. Edward, is she serious? She whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. She's lying. He snapped quickly, though his voice lacked its usual authority. This is nothing but a fabrication from an employee seeking attention. Amelia took a step closer, and in that small movement the air seemed to contract. Attention, she echoed. I've had 2 years to watch you from the shadows of your own building. I didn't come here to play games, Edward. I came to return something that was stolen from the small clutch at her side. She drew a delicate velvet box and opened it. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the contents caught the light. A gold hair comb, intricately engraved with the Langston family crest, studded with tiny diamonds. This was my mother's, given to her by Arthur Langston himself. She wore it on the night she was introduced as his daughter. I kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment to bring it back here. Tonight seemed fitting. Edward's jaw tightened. Where did you get that? It was never yours to lose, she said. Simply. The crowd shifted uneasily. The hierarchy, they knew Edward at the pinnacle. Untouchable, had just been challenged in the one arena he believed he controlled. And it wasn't bluster or desperation fueling Amelia's words. It was precision. This isn't about a trinket, Amelia continued, her voice calm but resonant enough to carry to the edges of the room. It's about the truth you buried along with my mother's place in this family. About the promises broken, the inheritance stolen, and the decades you spent making sure no one remembered Evelyn Langston ever existed. Some guests averted their eyes as if afraid the weight of her accusation could be transferred by proximity. Others leaned in, hungry for more. Edward's associates exchanged glances, the first threads of doubt weaving into their loyalty. Careful, Edward warned, his voice dropping low, his smile rigid. Amelia's gaze locked on his. I am careful. That's why I'm still standing. Here, the music had stopped without anyone noticing, the silence now total. Even the photographers had lowered their cameras, sensing that what they were witnessing was no longer a planned spectacle, but the start of something unpredictable. Somewhere deep in the crowd, a voice whispered what everyone was now thinking. If she's telling the truth, everything changes, and Amelia, standing at the heart of the ballroom, knew she had just lit the match. The fire would come next. The silence in the ballroom stretched, taut and electric, as if the very air had stopped moving. All eyes were fixed on Amelia and Edward, the gold hair comb glinting in her hand like a piece of truth pulled from the shadows. For a heartbeat, Edward stood frozen, his carefully crafted smile cracking under the weight of something he couldn't control. Then he tried to laugh aloud, to brittle an actor fumbling his lines in front of an audience that no longer believed in the script. That's enough, he said, turning to the crowd with an almost theatrical wave of dismissal. We've indulged this little fantasy long enough, but the performance was already slipping away from him. The rhythm of the room had shifted, and into that shift walked 3 figures through the grand double doors, each one carrying the kind of presence that made whispers scatter like startled birds. First came a woman in a dark blazer, her press badge glinting. Marianne Cole, the city's most relentless investigative journalist. Behind her was Victor Huang, a sharp-eyed inheritance lawyer known for never losing a case. And last, moving, with a gravity that pulled the entire room's attention, was Dr. Samuel Price, Arthur Langston's private physician in his final years. Helena's hand tightened on Edward's arm. Edward, what is this? She whispered. Marianne spoke first, her voice crisp but carrying an edge. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll want to keep your phones down for this. We're entering legal territory now. She nodded to Dr. Price. The doctor's face was pale, but his voice was steady. 21 years ago, I was threatened into signing a falsified death certificate for Arthur Langston. It claimed he died of heart failure. The truth is, Arthur was poisoned over several months with small doses of cyanide, a Collective gasps swept through the room. Champagne flutes trembled in hands, some guests unconsciously stepping back as if the truth itself were toxic. Edward's voice rose in sharp protest. "That's a lie. This man is trying to ruin my family, Doctor." Price's gaze didn't waver. Arthur discovered money was being siphoned from Langston capital accounts without authorization. He changed his will to include Amelia's mother and Amelia herself. He intended to bring the matter to the board and the authorities. That was when the symptoms began. Victor Huang stepped forward, producing a leather-bound folder from his briefcase. "This," he said, opening it to display neatly arranged documents, "is the original will, signed and notarized, naming Amelia Cross as a legal heir to half of Arthur Langston's estate. It was never executed because it was suppressed after Arthur's death. And here," he added, sliding out another sheet, "is the toxicology report from Arthur's exhumed remains, conducted last month by an independent lab. The cyanide levels were beyond lethal." The words landed like hammer strikes. Some guests began to murmur Amelia's name, their tones shifting from condescension to a mix of fascination and apprehension. Others were already stepping away from Edward as if the stain of scandal might spread by proximity. Edward's face flushed red. "You think this proves anything? Anyone could forge. Forging isn't necessary," Marian cut in. Her eyes locked on him like a predator's. "I have recordings, Edward. 5 separate conversations you had with Dr. Price between 2001 and 2002. In one of them, you threatened to ruin him if he opened his mouth about Arthur's blood work. Would you like me to play it?" A tremor passed through Edward's hand as he pointed at her. "You can't," but she was already pulling a small device from her bag. A moment later, Edward's own voice filled the ballroom, unmistakable. "Stripped of its public polish, if you open your mouth about anything strange in Arthur's blood, I'll make sure you never work as a doctor again. And that woman and her bastard daughter, they'll fend for themselves." The recording ended in a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone. Even those who had come expecting spectacle hadn't imagined this. Helena stepped away from her husband, her expression caught between horror and disbelief. "You," she whispered. "You really did this?" Edward's composure cracked fully now. "Helena, I don't," she said sharply, her voice carrying across the room. "Don't say my name like you still belong to the man I thought I married." Victor closed the folder with deliberate finality. "Given the evidence of murder, fraud, and suppression of a lawful will, the estate will be re-evaluated. Assets will be redistributed according to Arthur Langston's original wishes. Criminal charges will follow." Edward's mouth worked soundlessly, the weight of inevitability beginning to crush him. But Amelia stepped forward then, her voice low and precise, every word cutting through the air like glass. "You didn't just steal from me, Edward. You stole from my mother. You stole our name, our security, our place in the world. And when that wasn't enough, you took our future." Her words seemed to echo in the gilded space, reverberating off the marble and glass, impossible to ignore. Even the chandeliers seemed to gleam colder in the wake of what had been revealed. The crowd was no longer an audience to Edward's power. They were witnesses to his unraveling, and in the way they now looked at Amelia with something approaching respect, or perhaps caution. She knew the balance had shifted permanently. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, the faint wail of sirens began to rise. Inside, the music would not resume. The night had already found its true rhythm, and it beat in time with the reckoning that was now inevitable. The sirens grew louder until they filled the grand ballroom, a sound that didn't belong to such a place, but felt entirely right in that moment. The glass doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence slicing through what little composure Edward still clung to. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as they crossed the marble floor with measured steps, stopping only when they stood directly in front of him. One officer read the charges: murder, corporate fraud, embezzlement, suppression of a lawful will, while the other secured the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The sound of the metal locking shut seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Helena stood apart from him now, her arms folded tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't move to speak, didn't even flinch when Edward called her name in a voice that was suddenly small, almost pleading. The guests, who only hours earlier had greeted him with reverence, now stepped back to make room for his walk of shame. Phones lifted discreetly, capturing images that would dominate headlines by morning. Amelia didn't reach for him, didn't say a word. She simply stood, watching as he was led past the very chandelier under which he had intended to humiliate her. Outside, the flash of cameras intensified, the winter air cutting into the warm breath of onlookers. Reporters shouted questions as the police escorted him into the waiting car. Amelia followed only as far as the balcony, the city lights stretching out before her like a reminder that the world beyond these walls was already beginning to absorb the truth. 6 months later, the Langston name meant something entirely different. Edward Langston was serving a 30-year sentence without the possibility of parole. The conviction had been decisive, every charge proven beyond doubt. The web of financial crimes laid bare alongside the proof of Arthur Langston's murder. The court had ordered his personal fortune liquidated, the proceeds used to compensate victims of his schemes, and to honor the rightful terms of the original will. Amelia, now Amelia Langston, had stepped into a role no one in that ballroom could have imagined that night, co-owner and chief executive of Langston Capital. But she hadn't simply taken the reins of an empire, she had rebuilt its foundation. The old board, long complicit in Edward's excesses, had been replaced with leaders known for their integrity and commitment to fair practice. Wages for entry-level employees were raised, and promotions were based on merit rather than connections. Benefits expanded to include education stipends and comprehensive health care. Productivity rose sharply, but more importantly, the atmosphere in the company shifted. People walked the halls with their heads high. She directed part of the company's profits to launch a scholarship program for children from underserved communities, a microloan initiative for small business owners, and the largest domestic violence support fund in the state. In her first year, she personally visited every branch office, speaking with employees at every level, listening more than she talked. Helena visited her once, just before leaving the state with her children. She offered no excuses, only gratitude. "You could have destroyed us completely," she told Amelia quietly, "but you protected my children. I will never forget that." Amelia's answer was simple. Children don't pay for the sins of their parents. They deserve the chance to be better. Dr. Price now worked as a medical consultant for the company, providing free care for employees and their families. Mary Ann Cole declined several high-profile offers to turn the story into a book, choosing instead to continue her work uncovering corruption. Victor Huang became the company's chief legal advisor, ensuring that the mistakes of the past could not be repeated. In the months that followed, Amelia received invitations to speak at universities, leadership conferences, and social justice forums. Her story had become a symbol of resilience and the quiet power of preparation. But she turned down most offers, preferring to focus on the work itself. "I don't want to be known for surviving what he did to me," she told one interviewer. "I want to be known for what I built after." One afternoon, a letter arrived from the prison. The handwriting was Edward's. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, but needed her to know he had finally recognized the man he had become, and the man he could never be again. He mentioned that his children had asked to meet the aunt who had stepped in when their father failed them. Amelia didn't reply. Forgiveness was a private journey, and she had already chosen her path: justice, not vengeance. When a journalist from Forbes asked her about those who accused her of being too ruthless in exposing Edward, she answered without hesitation, "Revenge would have been to do to him what he did to me. Justice is making sure he pays for his crimes and that no one else suffers the way we did." There's a difference. That evening, she returned to her home, a place far from the cramped apartment where she had once nursed her plans in silence. In the living room, 2 young girls she had recently adopted were working on homework, their laughter filling the space with a kind of warmth she had almost forgotten existed. She sat with them, helping one sound out a word, showing the other how to solve a math problem. Outside, the city moved on, but inside, Amelia felt a quiet certainty. Her real victory wasn't in taking Edward down. It was in proving that power built on justice multiplies, lifting not just the one who holds it but everyone within its reach. And as she watched the girls leaning over their books, she knew that the legacy she was building would outlast every headline, every courtroom verdict. It would outlast her own name. Edward had underestimated her, just as so many others had. And in doing so, he had given her the perfect stage not for revenge, but for transformation. The night he planned to break her had become the night she stepped into the life she was meant to lead, and from that moment forward, she would use it to protect the very people men like him had always believed they could crush. In the end, the story of Amelia Langston was never just about the fall of Edward or the unveiling of decades-old secrets. It was a story about quiet preparation, resilience, and the refusal to be defined by the role others assigned to you. For 2 years, Amelia worked in the shadows of a man who had stolen her name, her inheritance, and her place in the world. She endured the smirks, the dismissive glances, the cruel jokes, each one becoming another piece in a larger puzzle she was building. When the time came, she stepped into the spotlight not as a victim desperate for sympathy, but as a force ready to reclaim what had been taken and to rewrite the ending entirely. What makes her journey remarkable isn't only the precision with which she dismantled Edward's empire, it's what she did afterward. Amelia understood that true victory lies not in leaving someone else's world in ruins, but in building something better in its place. She transformed a company that had thrived on exploitation into one that empowered its employees, supported communities, and created real opportunities for people who might otherwise be overlooked. She carried herself with dignity at every step, resisting the temptation to settle for revenge when justice could create lasting change. Her story challenges a belief many of us carry without questioning, that the powerful cannot be touched, and that those at the margins must accept the place they're given. Amelia proved that power can be reclaimed, not through brute force or reckless retaliation, but through patience, strategy, and a commitment to a higher purpose. She also showed that justice, when pursued with integrity, can outlast scandal and rebuild lives not just our own, but those around us. The deeper lesson is clear. Preparation is power, and dignity is a weapon in its own right. In our own lives, this means that when we face injustice, humiliation, or betrayal, the greatest response is not to lash out in the heat of anger, but to take the time to plan, to gather strength, and to act with precision. It means understanding that our end goal should not simply be to win against someone, but to create a reality in which the harm done cannot be repeated. Because we've built something stronger, more just, and more enduring. Ask yourself, in the challenges you face today, are you reacting, or are you preparing? Are you letting others define your story, or are you quietly writing a better one that will one day speak for itself? The transformation you seek might take time, but as Amelia's story reminds us, time can be an ally when paired with vision and purpose. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Amelia's place, what would you focus on first after winning justice, rebuilding your own life completely, or be using your position to help others as she did? Please share your answer in the comments so everyone can see different perspectives. And if you enjoyed this story and want more powerful, thought-provoking content, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you the stories that matter.